If you've ever watched someone lose something they spent their whole life building, a business, a home, something that had been in the family longer than anyone could remember, you know there's a moment that comes after. Not the moment they lose it, the moment after, when the thing is gone and they have to decide what they're carrying forward and what they're leaving behind. That moment came for hundreds of thousands of Great Plains farming families in the 1980s. Interest rates hit 21%. Iowa farmland lost 60% of its value between 1981 and 1986. Every single day, 250 farm families went out of existence. The banks took the land. The banks took the equipment. The banks took the buildings and the livestock and the harvested grain sitting in bins on ground. Those families had worked for decades. But there were 5 things the banks couldn't take. And the families who held on to those 5 things are the reason certain farms on the Great Plains are still in operation today. They kept the knowledge before a single acre changed hands, before the first foreclosure notice arrived in a rural mailbox. The most valuable thing on a Great Plains farm was already stored somewhere the bank had no claim to, inside the farmer's head. What this specific piece of ground does in a wet spring. Which field drains first, where the soil goes thin at the east corner, and why you don't push it in a dry year? Which variety did well in 1974, and what happened to the neighbor who ignored that information in 1978? Knowledge like that takes 20 years to build and can't be seized by any creditor. Some of the farmers who lost their land in the 1980s went to work as hired men on the same farms that had absorbed theirs, because the new owners, often investors who had never farmed a day in their lives, needed someone who actually knew what they were looking at. The knowledge traveled with the person and not with the deed. And for the families who eventually found their way back to farming, on rented ground, on a neighbor's parcel, on 40 acres carved out of what had been sold, that knowledge was the only reason the new operation worked at all. They kept each other. In 1983 and 1984, protesters showed up at foreclosure auctions across Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas with a specific plan. When the auctioneer opened the bidding on a neighbor's seized tractor or combine, one of them would call out a bid, 5 cents. The crowd around them made clear that the next legitimate bid would not be welcome. Total proceeds at some of those auctions came in under $10. The equipment went back to the family it had been taken from. This was not a new idea. Farmers in the 1930s had done the same thing. Penny auctions, they called them then, and the farmers who revived the practice in the 1980s knew exactly what they were doing. They were saying out loud, in front of a sheriff's deputy and an auctioneer, that what connected them to their neighbors was worth more than the bank's paperwork. By 1985, half the counties in Iowa had some organized grassroots effort working to address the crisis. Less than 2% of farmers ever took part in a public protest. But the networks built in those years, neighbors who knew each other's debt situation, who had sat at each other's kitchen tables, who had watched each other's auctions, those networks outlasted the crisis and gave the farms that survived a community to operate inside rather than in isolation. That would have made survival nearly impossible. They kept their seeds. This one is quiet enough that it rarely makes the history books. When a farm was foreclosed on, and the equipment was hauled away, and the bank's representative walked through to inventory the assets, almost no one thought to inventory the glass jars on the shelf in the basement, the seed jars, open-pollinated varieties that farmers had been saving and selecting for generations before. The hybrid seed industry made it standard practice to buy new seed every year. Some families took nothing else. A woman in rural Nebraska who lost her farm in 1985 told an oral historian years later that when they packed to leave, her husband loaded the truck with the family's clothes and the kitchen table and one cardboard box that he handled more carefully than anything else. The seeds from varieties his grandfather had grown, and his father had grown, and he had grown for 20 years, on ground he would never farm again. He replanted them the following spring on 2 rented acres outside the town where they'd moved. He didn't know why exactly, except that throwing them away felt like the last thing he wasn't willing to do. They kept farming, just differently. Gabe Brown's farm in North Dakota nearly went under 4 times between 1995 and 1998. Hail and drought in sequence. The kind of run that makes a person question every decision they've ever made. Nearly broke and unable to afford the inputs conventional farming required, Brown started doing what desperation sometimes forces a person to do. He stopped buying what he couldn't afford and started working with what the land already had. No-till farming, cover crops, integrated livestock, a deliberate reduction from 2,000 row crop acres down to 800, with 1,200 acres returned to perennial prairie. What he built over the following 2 decades became one of the most studied regenerative farm operations in the country. People call him the guru of smarter agriculture now. He doesn't particularly like the title. What he would tell you, if you asked him how the farm survived, is that the financial crisis forced him to stop doing what the industry told him to do and start paying attention to what the land was actually capable of. The crisis cost him 4 years. The lesson it forced on him is the reason the farm is still there. They kept saying it out loud. There is a journal entry written by a farm wife in southern Iowa on December 6, 1984, that has been quoted in more farm crisis accounts than almost any other document from that decade. I feel 100 years old, 14 years of farming, and we never made a dime. I'm 44 years old, and I'm back to zero. I'm ready to sell out. I hate to lose my home place, but I can accept defeat when I have to. I could mourn forever all the lost dreams. What is remarkable about that entry is not the despair in it. It's that she wrote it down. In a culture where, as one researcher put it, farm men put up walls of silence, isolation, and denial, this woman wrote it down. And the people who organized around the crisis, who built hotlines and advocacy groups and grassroots networks, understood something the silence was trying to prevent. If you said what was happening out loud, to a neighbor, to a crisis counselor, to a journalist or a senator, it became real in a way that could also be addressed. Willie Nelson understood it too, which is why the first Farm Aid concert in Champaign, Illinois, in September of 1985, drew 78,000 people and raised millions of dollars, not primarily because of the money, but because it said to every farm family sitting in a kitchen somewhere, reading a foreclosure notice, you are not alone in this. That message said out loud kept more people farming than any policy change did. The banks took a lot. Between 1980 and 1994, more than 1,600 banks insured by the FDIC failed, many of them rural agricultural banks that had lent on the same ground they were now foreclosing on. Since the early 1980s, around 600,000 farms have disappeared from the American landscape. The Great Plains has been losing population in most counties for 40 years running. What didn't disappear was what couldn't be seized. The knowledge carried inside a person. The neighbor who showed up at the auction. The seeds in the glass jar in the basement. The decision to farm differently when farming the same way had stopped being possible. The journal entry that said, out loud, what was actually happening. The farms on the Great Plains that are still in family hands today, on the same ground with the same names. On the mailboxes, they didn't survive because the bank was generous with them. They survived because there were things the bank never thought to take. New stories every week on Deep Furrow.